Welcome to the Raw Rugby League podcast. I'm Meehall Wood, and today we're dealing with a much discussed, but I would say little understood part of rugby league, psychology. We talk pretty endlessly about mental strength, resilience, and motivation, but how much do we actually know about it? When a team loses, it's because they didn't want it enough, and when they win, it's because they wanted it more, right? Probably not. I'm no expert, but the great thing about this podcast is that I can call up people who are and get them all to explain it to me. This week's guest is Dr Jo Lukins, a performance psychologist who has worked in rugby league for well over 2 decades, most prominently with the North Queensland Cowboys, NRLM and NRLW, as well as the PNG international team, especially the Orchids, which is where we first met, in the WNBL, the Australian Defence Force. That's the actual army, not a sports team, though it sounds like one. And countless elite athletes on a one-to-one basis. She's also the author of The Elite, Think Like an Athlete, Succeed Like a Champion, which I would heartily recommend. A new book, Belief, which is due out imminently. Welcome to the show, Jo.
Good morning, Mike. Nice to be with you. Thanks for having me on the show.
And good afternoon, because you're in Queensland and I'm in New South Wales, and I still find that strange.
We're just getting close to afternoon, but yes. Thank you for your patience in helping me work out the timetable and to come onto the show.
That's all right. I don't understand why the sheep in Queensland are different to New South Wales. I'm not even going to start to.
I was going to say that's a whole podcast in and of itself, isn't it?
Yeah, not the Rugby League one, thankfully. But so I'm so thankful that you've come on, because we first met in the Rugby League World Cup when you were in your job at the Orchids, and you are one of the OGs of sports psychology. As we were just discussing about, my mother was also one of these who worked back in the late 1980s with Hull FC and Salford in the Super League, and then at the GB women's team. You obviously worked pretty much as long as she had. So I guess the most obvious question is, what does a sports psychologist actually do on the day-to-day to help rugby league players be the best version of themselves?
Yeah, it's a great question to start the conversation with, isn't it? And absolutely, full credit to your mum being one of the trailblazers for sports psychology. So I guess sports psychology, I think it's probably been 3 decades that I've been involved with it, and it has changed and shifted over that time. So when I first started, it was very new, and so people weren't entirely sure what sports psychology might mean. You know, I think people thought I could read their minds and I had all sorts of superpowers, none of which I have, which my kids are very grateful for. But essentially the kinds of support that someone in a sports psychology or mental skills coach can offer a team is really dealing with the psychological component of sport, which sounds so obvious, doesn't it? But if you take a sport like rugby league, where there are so many moments in our head that are played out on the field. So, you know, you might have a player coming on who feels anxious. You might have a player coming on who feels really excited and motivated. You might have a player returning from an injury. You might have a team that's coming on backing up from a substantial loss or a substantial win. So there's all those individual intricacies of people. And what sports psychology aims to do is help athletes be better at what they're doing. So a lot of my work is in the performance enhancement space. So I'll work with athletes who are, you know, and it might be something, you know, that we're, you know, just come through pre-season phase. So we might be looking at goals and goal setting, what a team's values are, how we act consistently with those. And then it's really about capacity building for athletes, coaches and teams about mentally how can they ride the highs and the lows of rugby league, because, you know, it's a week by week sport. You know, that cliche of you're as good as your last game. And so it's the ability of athletes to be able to manage all of those mental aspects of it, I guess. So largely what a sports psychologist will offer that's a little bit different to general psychology is that specific focus on the performance enhancement. But then, of course, we're dealing with people. So, you know, we're trained in all of the other psychological areas. You know, people have a life outside of footy and deal with all those challenges. So some sports psychologists may also provide support in that area as well. Other teams might actually get other psychologists in to help with the more life-focused side of things for people.
I'm fascinated by where this sits in sort of a triangle. I'm glad this, for those watching on YouTube, you can see my hands on this, where you sort of have the coaching level and the playing level, and then you're kind of a conduit between the two, but also separate to the two, where from a professional perspective, as a psychologist, you have to deal with the person who's in front of you, but you are aware of the team that you are part of, that you ultimately, the point of you being there is that the team wins further games. So how do you manage that dynamic within the sort of general I always think that if the player says something to you that they don't want the coach to know, they have to be comfortable to say that, and then you have to be able to relate that feeling. I find it must be a difficult sort of position to be in, but that's, I guess, where you earn your money, right?
Well, it's an important position to be in because, Mike, exactly what you've talked about there is that's your first conversation from the psychological point of view, because you're absolutely right. I can't help a player who can't say to me, I'm not sleeping at night because I'm thinking about my contract negotiations and Club X are interested in me and I play for Club Y, so we need to be able to discuss that, but there needs to be all of those boundaries that you would normally have within psychology, where as a client you can talk about the things that are concerning you and so forth, where you can have a conversation with a coach where they might discuss what's happening for an athlete from their perspective that would probably be said in a way that may not necessarily be articulated the same way for the player. So I guess those challenges are there for us in psychology. The way I navigate it, so I don't actually find it too challenging, but I guess I've been doing it for a while, is in the back of my head, I'm always asking myself, who is the client? Right now, who is the client? So whilst I might work for a club, if I'm sitting one-on-one with a player at that particular moment in time, that's the person that I'm working with. If I'm working with a coach, then it's a coach that I'm supporting. So you're right. You definitely need to navigate it well, because confidentiality and if you don't provide a safe place to have a conversation, then I would always say to players, if you don't feel safe within the conversation, don't have it. Whoever you're talking to. So it's a really important part of me getting my job done well.
And I'm interested as well in that when at the start of your job in the 90s, there wouldn't have been as big a public conversation about mental health. And so the players that you're talking to are relatively, I would say, would have been quite uninformed. Whereas I think it'd be surprising now to meet a player who didn't have that context, just because the world has changed so much. Is that something that I would say this broadly would be a positive thing, that people are aware of these things more than they used to be. But is that something that you've noticed as your career's gone on?
Yeah, it's been really apparent. So when I started, and when I started working rugby league, I was about 25, 26. So I was actually the same age as some of our players, so I was it was more like a kind of a peer discussion. And whereas now I very definitely could be their parent in terms of the age brackets, but that's okay. We navigate through that. But certainly the understanding, like mental health wasn't part of the conversation back in the 90s. That wasn't the focus that we had. And I would agree with you that I think that our ability now to recognise that mental health, and I'm always really careful to put the point across that when we talk about mental health, we're not necessarily always talking about anxiety and depression and so forth. Mental health is about thriving and succeeding, and so it's a more holistic picture. I think sometimes people think when we talk about mental health, we're just talking about when things aren't going so well. The observation I would now make about players, and I wouldn't want to generalize to everyone, but I think there's a general acceptance, understanding and willingness by players to have conversations in that mental health space. There's certainly an expectation that it will be part of the game. And of course, there were players back in the 90s that did want to talk about those sorts of things. And then there's players today who are less comfortable to talk about it. So you've just got to meet the person, the coach, the player, the football manager, whoever it is, where they're at in the part of the conversation, and then help them to navigate through, any of the things that you can do to help the athlete be better, the team be better, and then for them to be, ultimately successful.
Yeah, a good example might be, or a sort of analogy might be that once upon a time you could play rugby league and never lift a weight in your life if you were good enough at footy. And the idea of playing rugby league now without lifting weights is completely pointless. Like, nobody would ever do it. And I guess if you're coming through the grades now, this is an expectation. It's not wouldn't it be good if you spoke to this person? It's like, no, you have to speak to this person because they're going to make you better. And if you'll be behind all your peers if you don't do this.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. And I can remember one of the coaches that I worked with in the 90s who said to me that they thought one of the biggest innovations in rugby league had been video replay. So before that time, obviously coaching rugby league was very different. So that to actually have video replay was a really important part of the coaching pathway. And then their observation was that they thought the next area for growth for the clubs that utilize it and understand its importance with sports psychology, because what we're building, and I know you've had lots of experts on the show before in the physical space, is that science is always refining, and it's how can we build athletes who are strong and adaptable and have all of the skill sets that we need. And so there's still plenty of room in that space to go, but athletes are, they're all pretty strong and they're all pretty fast. And so where there is the potential for building that extra part of the football IQ, I guess, is through that mental space. So clubs and teams that pay attention to that will reap the rewards from it.
Yeah, you just reminded me that this isn't on the running order, but you just made me think of a really, hopefully useful question, which is in one of our previous episodes, which was mostly about statistics. Rob Lowe, who's the expert I spoke to, said that the most important players on the team were the guys who sort of the bottom 10 in the roster of top 30, because they were the ones who would have to come in. And if those guys could be up to the level, then you could lose injury. You lose players to injuries and suspension, which everybody gets, but you would be less effective. Now, one of the questions I wanted to ask you about the sort of the very elite players, but before we get that, I wonder what your experience is with the sort of the less elite players, because I know that when you speak to coaches, there's certain coaches who can speak to Nathan Cleary and Jonathan Thurston and hit on their level, who then just can't talk to the worst guy in the team because they never, not to say Benji Marshall is like this, but Benji Marshall was coaching at the West Tigers with lots of non-elite players when he was an elite player. So there's probably a barrier there and he can do stuff that they can't do. And I wonder where you as a psychologist can try and sort of work in such a weak link sport like rugby league to try and raise the level of everybody so that they feel that actually I can compete at this level, because I know if I went in, I would be overawed by having Jonathan Thurston or somebody like that. I go, I'm nowhere near as good as him. But how do you talk to the sort of the lower end of the roster before you get on?
I think what you've tapped into is a really important point there about, because they are your future elite players, so where they're at the moment, well, and not all of them will get to the elite level, but some of them will. And I've heard many coaches say, investing time in those players is crucially important, because for, the example you give, you might not plan on playing them for the next 18 months, but an injury can happen and then suddenly they're up next week. So when you build capacity in players who are coming through the ranks, if we want to describe it that way, that becomes incredibly important. And I would even suggest that where you've got pathway systems, you want to be starting even earlier than that. So, that's one of the things that I'm really enjoying watching development in rugby league in PNG as an example. And I guess my particular lens is looking through the women's game. So kind of started back to front with, having the Orchids there and at the World Cup. But you can really see now, and there's been some recent announcements about where the pathway programs are going for women in PNG. So when you can start working with 17-year-olds, 19-year-olds, and potentially you've got to cover all those basics, the low-hanging fruit. We need our athletes to be able to get sufficient sleep. We need them to know how to create great habits. Like people want us to think that high performance is all about the bright and shiny stuff, and certainly that makes a difference. But if you don't have your foundations in place, then there's no point tinkering with the bright and shiny stuff. So, I'm a big fan of going to the basics with our elite level players, making sure that, you've got all those sort of ducks lined up, if you like. But I do think in that band of emerging players, but even those that aren't even there yet, I've worked with clubs and associations across different sports and in rugby league where, I really see the value in it. If you're talking about habits, if you're talking about sleep with your 17-year-olds, by the time they're your 25-year-olds or your 23-year-olds playing in their peak, then you can just do more in terms of building their psychological mindset. So it works really well.
Yeah, you've just touched on. You haven't seen this question, but it is on my big long list of questions. I've got so many questions. We're not going to touch on any of them. But one of the things that I read in your book, The Elite, right? It's super interesting to hear you talk to the elite athletes. But one of the things that I found was most interesting was about the habit forming stuff, which is more. I know the analogy you use in the book is about how it's easy to try and get someone who eats in the afternoon to just not eat because they'll lose control of their weight. That's not, you wouldn't think of that as a sports psychology issue. That's a general life issue about, snacking too much or whatever. But if you are an elite athlete who needs to be at a certain body fat percentage in a certain way, or whether that's up or down, I'm sure it works the other way for players who need to put on weight and just can't force themselves to eat. This is something like that habit forming stuff that is very day-to-day, quite banal, is actually the thing that's going to make you into the better player in 5 years' time. And trying to make an individual realize that that's something they have agency over must be a real challenge within your field.
It absolutely is, because even though we're talking about elite athletes, we've got to remember that elite athletes are people. So people are prone to all of those sorts of things. So, if I gave you the earth-shattering news that people are more likely to break a habit in the early afternoon, you'd go, oh, duh, Joe. No surprises. We're heading for the snack machine at 3:00, and, I'm more likely to be virtuous and have porridge for breakfast. So it's easier to resist the temptations in the pantry at that time of the day. But the reality is, athletes are working under fatigue as well. They've got travel, all of those sorts of things. So if you think for yourself, anyone listening in or watching in, if you are tired, if you are hungry, I use the HALT acronym. If you're hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, look out in terms of your habits. There's a very good chance that we go, oh, I'll be better tomorrow, or I won't start a new habit because it's Wednesday, and who would start a new habit on the 22nd of the month or something like that? Like, no one does that. Wait till the 1st of the month and wait for a Monday. So we come up with all these funny ways of understanding the world, and athletes do exactly the same thing. So when we can, and I guess one of the ways that I like to put it to athletes is not, well, and I certainly don't, it's a psychology thing, I think. Like, I don't tell athletes what to do. No one wants to be told what to do. And I will say to them, the choice is yours. So if we're talking about, they're talking to me about their nutrition, I'll say the choice is absolutely yours. The question you can ask yourself with some curiosity when you're about to eat something in the afternoon is ask yourself whether that food choice gets you closer to your goals or further from your goals. So then you can look at that ham and salad sandwich, say, with scrutiny and go, well, yeah, some protein in there and some veggies and everything. So yeah, that's probably a good fuel for me to eat this afternoon, say, and so you eat it. You could also be standing at the vending machine where chances are there's not a ham and salad roll in the vending machine, but there'll be other options. And again, just curiously ask yourself the question and say, if I choose to eat that now, is that getting me closer to my goals or further from them? And maybe that helps you to make that decision. So it is the reality of elite high performance from a psychological perspective is actually getting the fundamentals right. It's not that, bright and shiny. And so, I know some people like to come forward with the bright and shiny ideas and people like to jump on it because it seems like the easy fix. It's all the day-to-day, somewhat hard stuff that we do that day after day builds and then creates a great foundation for success on the field.
Yeah, and much as I think we've done that here, right? We've gone through the foundational stuff, and we can move on to the bright and shiny now, because one of the things that really stood out of your book is the analogy, which I have to say I've never thought about this, but this is possibly the best example of it. I'm a big man for the best athletes have a short memory. You forget all your successes and failures basically as soon as you've done them, and you move to the next thing. And you mentioned that Jonathan Thurston's sort of penalty goal that he misses late in the 2015 grand final, he just flushes it and then kicks the field goal to win it. Obviously, Jonathan wrote the foreword for your book, so he's obviously a favourite. But do you think there's something in that in terms of like a teachable moment in which you can? Is that something you can train, or is that something that people just have in them? Because I know if I go out and play soccer with my mates and I, mess up, I'm thinking about it in bed, and that was me playing five-a-side. It's not. That's me playing the lowest possible level of sport, and it kills me because I know I don't have that.
Yeah, so, and I know we want to talk the bright and shiny, but you're going to have to forgive me, Mike. I'm going to bring in what I was just saying, because what happens when we make a mistake or we have a fantastic moment in sport, whatever it is, we either let the try in or we score it, to keep it in rugby league. How we then respond to that mentally. So the inner coach, the self-commentary that's going on in my head at that moment, I've either just let the try in or I've just scored it. There's a very good chance that my thinking is a habit. So, it's likely for most people, including the elite, that the way you choose to interpret a situation, the ability for you to be able to flush it when you need to and so forth, is a habit of thinking. And if you don't pay attention to that, then it will control you. You can't do anything about it unless you notice it. So one of the things that I say to athletes, particularly to all athletes, but let's stick with the elite, is that first thing you need to do is pay attention. So you've just had something go well. Where did your head go to? You just had something not go so well. Where did your head go to? Be curious about that. And then it's about the athlete's ability to navigate through what I call the 3 passages of time. So all of us have only got 3 passages of time. What's happened to us in the past, what's happening to us right now, and what's going to happen to us in the future. So that last moment, whether I was scoring the try or it was coming, scored behind me, is gone. It's now history. I know it's recent history, but it's history. And there's a very good chance that me standing on the field, beating myself up mentally for being so terrible of letting this thing happen, doesn't get me closer to my goal of what I've got to do in the next moment. So past, present, and future, being able to navigate that mentally is a really important skill for athletes. Physically, it's easy because you're in the moment and I'm in the moment. I know that because neither of us have the superpowers to magic ourselves into 8 o'clock tonight or what I was doing yesterday. So physically, you can only ever be in the moment. Mentally, you're a time traveler. So that example that you give, of the 2015 grand final it's about an athlete's ability to get their head in the right place at the right time. What serves me best right now? Where should my focus be? What do I need to be doing? And it's playing the last 30 seconds of the game or whatever that's going to be after that particular moment. But you're right, that ability to park it, use a black box, flush it. There's lots of different analogies that get used in sport, and athletes have got to find what's going to work for them. It definitely is about spending enough time in the past to learn the lesson. So if I was working with a player and they're walking off the field at halftime, then it is useful for them in that moment to reflect on that half and see what the lessons are. What did they do well? Where's the room for improvement? And what's going to happen as a result of that? So there is definitely merit in thinking back in that moment because you've got time to do it. And then you head into the sheds and you grab your drink of water and you do whatever, and then you get coach's address. And then perhaps as you're walking out of the sheds back onto the field, your mind might gravitate to what am I going to do next? What does this next 40 minutes look like for me or however long is left? So I think what I see in elite athletes is it's their ability to understand getting their head in the right place at the right time. It's all timing.
Yeah, I was just explaining off air that there's one of my favorite sort of weird statistical quirks is that the correlation between not so much tries but assists and errors is very high. And if you look, Reece Walsh, most try assists, most errors. Tom Trebojevic permanently makes loads of errors, and he just doesn't care about them. And I wonder, I know I spoke to one of the coaches at the Broncos last year, Lee Breers, who was one of my heroes growing up, who played in the UK. And he played like that every single game as a player. And now he coaches the attack at the Broncos. And he just said, just throw it over the sideline. Because you might throw 2 over the sideline, but we only need you to land 1 of them. And if you land 1 of them and then we score, then we only have to do that so many times a game and we win the game. And you empower that player. And I wonder how much, obviously as a psychologist, you're dealing with the individuals and with the collective group because you're dealing with, I guess, all the individuals and the coaches. And how much of that is something that you need to coach into a person? How much is that something that you need to foster an environment or make sure that the coach is fostering an environment where that sort of failure is, you don't encourage failure, but you know what I mean? That they don't feel punished if they make mistakes, because you can see there are certain teams where players look terrified to make mistakes and some certain teams where they think, it doesn't matter, we defend our errors.
Yeah, that's right. And the term I tend to use is error recovery. It's how do you recover from an error, as opposed to, and it's even the language around it, isn't it? So the athlete who says, I just made a mistake, that was a failure, instantly, that's the first thing I'm wanting to talk to them about, So, well, was it a failure or did it just not go the way you wanted it to? What does it mean for you? Like some people might say, and that's where you've got to look at people on a case-by-case basis. I might define a failure for me, and that might actually spur me on and motivate me and actually be helpful. Someone else might say that's a failure and they'll have this terrible negative spiral and you may as well take them off the field, So everyone will respond to that self-talk in a different way. And it's understanding and I guess that's the art of coaching, isn't it? Is understanding all the humans in front of you and how to get the best from each of them. But athletes certainly need to have an understanding. One of the other things I like to talk to athletes about is the difference between perfection and excellence. Like, if everyone listening to our conversation now would like to, in their mind, think of the perfect rugby league player, like who is actually perfect, I think would be hard pressed to actually think. We know some really great players, but is there a perfect rugby league player? I don't think so. So striving for perfection is setting yourself up for failure. And where athletes will be more benefited by will be focusing on excellence. So if we think about who are excellent rugby league players, well, I think I probably need a piece of paper that my list would be so long. But there's no perfect, particularly in rugby league with the sport that it is. It's errors are actually part of the game. And when you understand that, and you can, use an error as an opportunity for learning if you've got time, because I've had coaches say to me they don't mind their players making errors because that means they're out there having a crack and having a go. Now, they probably don't want them to make the same error 4 times. Then you're going to get a little chat. But if errors are part of the game, it's how you respond to them that's going to be most important then in moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, that coach's aspect as well is like you find a lot of, half of coaching. I write about tactics and stuff like that all the time, and I think half of coaching is the on the field tactics, and half of it is getting the people, the humans, to actually enact what you tell them to do. And you can often see that sort of at the end of the death spiral of a coach is when the players just stop listening and start making up as they go along. And I wonder, from your perspective, obviously you are that conduit between sort of right in the middle of that, whether you speak to the players, but also you have to feed back to the coaches on, maybe this guy needs to be more of a leader, or maybe this guy, he needs an arm around him, this guy needs to kick up the backside. Where does your role fit into that in terms of understanding the different dynamics across the group, and how, obviously the players talk to you in confidentiality, but you can feed back to them like, look, this guy's probably not going to go well if you shout at him, whereas the other guy, he probably needs that. How do you factor all those different bits in and feed back up the chain to the coach?
Yeah, it really, I guess, is testament to the relationship that a sports psych will have with a coach. And so, and I guess over a career, I've worked with lots of coaches with different styles. And typically what I'll find is that coaches will have a pretty good sense of a lot of the athletes that are in front of them. They will have tried shouting at someone and saw the outcomes of it. And then, so it's not too often that I'm coming in with a coach that hasn't got as much knowledge of the players. I've had a couple of moments of that in my career. So obviously with Cowboys women were new to the NRLW competition last year. So even though the coach knew many of the players, we were working together with a really fresh new group. And the same things happened with PNG in the Rugby League World Cup, and then again in the Pacific Championships last year. So a sports psychologist in the team is another sports professional. They're another resource, and it's really about fitting in with the style of the coach and what they're open to. The coaches I've found that I work really well with have a style where they are open to feedback, and we have a good enough conversation that I can offer that feedback. Now, I've had plenty of coaches across, if I think about all the sports that I've worked with, there's been times when I've offered feedback and coaches said, thanks, Joe, and then promptly disregarded it. And you know what? They're the coach, and that's totally, it's their gig. It's they're in charge, and the first person that anyone's going to come looking at in terms of results will be the coach. So, but I think it's just having that opportunity to have conversations and how can we bring combinations together, those sorts of things. So there's potential there. And what I find is every coach has their own style and preference and their level of buy-in to that sports psychology role. And I'm very respectful of that because it is their team. It is, in terms of they are the head coach or the assistant coaches that you're working with, and they've got an awful lot of responsibility with that. And I always say, it's a heavy head that wears the crown. So if I can help with that, then I'm always happy to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I know this is something that's been relatively topical at the time we're recording, and hopefully this will come out soon if it still is. But I mean, definitely, because rugby league players are always going to get dropped. But we've seen in the last week here, we've seen Jackson Hastings, who was dropped at the Knights, Lachlan Elliott dropped at Souths, and that's something that, like, it's a reality of professional sport in which players are going to rise and fall within the group, and the coach is the one who has to deal with that. Where do you come into that particular aspect? Because there's no greater feeling of rejection, right, in saying, well, you used to play all the time and now you don't get to play anymore. How do you work around the sort of the harsh realities of sport? Because that, it doesn't happen in a regular job. That you don't get dropped from working on the the checkout at Coles, but you do get dropped from South Sydney Rabbitohs or the Newcastle Knights, and it's not something like it's a pretty these guys are emotional guys at the best of times. I find that's going to be a real blow to their ego and to their confidence and stuff like that. And it's kind of up to you as a sports side to kind of pick up the pieces and put it back together and tell them they'll be brilliant again.
Yeah,
or work out where in the place.
Certainly, we are talking about a group of people who, like you say, we're all emotional, but are highly competitive, and no one's looking forward to getting dropped when that happens. And some people will understand it and will use it as fuel for fire. I'm always curious about, when they are, if they're talking about the fact that they've been dropped, what their understanding of it is, do they see the level of responsibility for where their game could have been better? Was it actually because somebody else was playing better? I'm always talking to athletes, particularly in that pre-season phase, about the difference between collaboration and competition in a team. Like, you need your team, your larger squad, to be collaborating and working together, but you also need them to be absolutely competitive with each other in particular moments, so that if you and I are doing a 1.2, in competing with each other, we also bring out the best in each other as well. So it's managing all of that, and every athlete will do it so differently. Some players, if they've got that skill we were talking about before, where they're able to go, right, that's last week, this is this week, what can I focus on? One of the key psychological points I would always sort of steer an athlete towards, if that's what's happened to them, is to focus on the controllables. Like team selection is done by somebody else. The best you can do is to do your job in the best possible way to make it impossible to not get picked. And even when you make it impossible to not get picked, sometimes you still don't get picked, because Fred next to you is actually just that little bit better, or is going to meet the need of the team for that week, or whatever it is. But it's, I guess, if a player was to come to me because they had been dropped, I'd want them to talk a bit about the emotions that's sitting around it for them, so I knew what it was, and they could have, a debrief and get it off their chest kind of thing. But then it's really about, okay, so now what? What can you do now to make a difference in this situation? What's the feedback you've had from the coaches? Where do you need to improve? What are you going to do? What's it going to look like? What will you do in training this week? What will you do this week when you've been pushed back to the grade below you, and all those sorts of things? So how athletes choose to manage that, you want to see a blend of probably both a response and a reaction in those situations.
Yeah, it's something that I think of this a lot, right? Maybe this is how I empathize with footballers. I don't know why, but I know last year's a guy, Paul Momorowski, right? Played in the grand final, won a premiership with Melbourne maybe, or Penrith. He played for the Roosters once last year, I think, once or twice. He came back to the team to play in a semi-final, I think against Cronulla. And he had been injured, but he'd also not been in the team. And I could remember him playing a game just because there was a late pitch change that didn't have proper goalposts. Like, he was playing on a school field with the half soccer posts, half footy posts. He's playing the Super League now. And I thought, what is the mental journey that he's gone on, where he's gone, I've played in the grand final and now I'm playing on this pitch that doesn't have proper goals. But then somebody gets injured in the top grade and he's back playing in the finals. He's not played all year. And I just think how it must be so difficult to try and stay present and not to think about that the whole time, because it must, the sort of the vicissitudes of rugby league, right? One day you're playing on a park field, and the next you're playing in the grand final. It must be so hard to deal with just on an emotional level. And for all and I guess this is another point I wanted to bring up, but these people, especially, I like the elite person within their social group. Everybody looks up to them, and 20 other people follow every game and all this sort of stuff. And that must be something that you have to deal with, because you're not just dealing with this player who's got a life that's up and down based on things he basically can't control, but also all these other people whose only interaction with him is to do with the thing that he also can't control.
Yeah. And that's very much the case. So players have to be able to navigate that. And I don't want to downplay it, but what I've seen work successfully for a lot of players is when they say, okay, so like you said, it was the grand final a month ago, and this week I'm playing out on the local paddock with divots in it, and cows going past. I don't know, whatever it might be. But I'm playing rugby league, and so for some players, that's what you've got to bring it back to. So you're playing rugby league wherever you are, whatever jersey it is that you're wearing, you've got a role to do, play, and a job to do. And you're right, that's not like, I don't say that flippantly, like that's an easy just do that. But that's the reality of what they've got to be able to do. Successful. And what I do find is that particularly in that elite space, there's an understanding by players about what this pathway looks like, and that, you don't know how long you've got. There's not many players that get to exit on their own terms and so forth. I mean, I'm sure there's figures on it. I've never actually looked to see what they are, but, for many players, careers can be cut short by non-selection, injury, club choices heading in a different direction, whatever that might be. So players understand that. They don't like it when it happens to them, understandably, nor would any of us. So it's just about how you navigate that territory and having trusted people that you can talk to. Now, you're talking to me as a sports psych, but there's lots of other roles within a team too, including the coach, family members, a wellbeing manager, an assistant coach. There's a range of people that they can go to talk through some of these things. And what I always say to players is, don't go and talk to everybody, because that's too many, but find your trusted souls, whoever you connect with and resonate with, and talk through what's going on for you. That can be helpful. The other thing I see a lot of players do that is helpful for sorting out their thoughts is to journal. And again, this is something that I wouldn't have necessarily seen 30 years ago, but lots of players will use journaling to kind of think through their ideas, and there's really good evidence base behind how journaling can be helpful for people that enjoy it. So
I think, I'm just as you were saying that, I was thinking of something that my mother told me of a player that she dealt with. Well, this would have been 30 years ago as well, but we only see them on a field, right, for 80 minutes every week. And you don't realize that these people obviously we all realize that they're also people, but like that they are the product of where they come from, their environment. They have partners, children, mothers, fathers, etc. And she told me this story. Just when I said I would speak to you, I've got hundreds of stories about sports psychology from the early 1990s. But one of them was an Aussie player who'd moved to England, whose wife just didn't get on with the other wives. And so didn't matter how well he played, because all she wanted to do was move back to Australia. It was cold, it was wet, she didn't like it. She didn't get on with the other women. She found everybody in, I don't know where it was, Yorkshire, whatever it was. These people are really cold. Where I'm from, everyone's really warm, like emotionally, which I would understand being from the north of England. Australians are a lot more generally warm to each other than we are. I feel like it's nuanced, but cultural differences. And that's something that they, that it was nothing to do with how good he was at footy. And that's something that he never, because she was involved in that environment, she could talk to him about it and say, actually, the problem here is this, this, and this. It's nothing to do with him particularly, or to do with his ability to perform on a field. And I wonder how much now there is more of an understanding, perhaps, of this holistic environment that surrounds players, and what they, that isn't, 80 minutes out of your week isn't actually that much when you think of how long you spend doing everything else.
That's right. And I think that what I've seen, and obviously I've seen more of some clubs and less of others, but that focus on family and connection is really important. And I know lots of clubs make lots of efforts around how do we make this an inclusive community, because what clubs recognise is that players who are also comfortable and settled at home, there's very few players that can really pigeonhole their lives, that can step out of a home environment or personal environment, whatever's going on, and just absorb themselves in their footy. Some people do it very well. They go, okay, well, footy's my release, but then it's tough if you're not getting picked, or something, you've got an injury, a little niggly injury or something like that. So that's one of the other things that I think I've seen. I think it was building through the 90s as well, because there used to be evidence of it that I used to see, but the recognition of family and family values becomes very important within clubs, and that's part of that connection. Because again, coming back to what are we dealing with? We're dealing with people, and humans need connection, and that's one of the key facets that helps keep us mentally robust.
Something, just because it was our last episode, was with John Nulliford talking about Pacific players, and I know that you work with the PNG team, and there's things that he was talking about in terms of that space, like the way that Pacific athletes, which is what 50% of the NRL, I think it's actually 55% of the NRLW, it's a much more family-oriented culture than sort of the traditional Aussie, family. When you have sort of a nuclear family as opposed to an extended family, a collectivist culture as opposed to a slightly more individualistic culture. And that must be something that you've noticed working with the girls and from PNG particularly, because some of them will have grown up in Australia in a very different environment to girls who grew up in Papua New Guinea. And I wonder how you navigate that particular space where there is such people who are ostensibly from the same culture but will have a totally different experience of it, having grown up in different places, and the way that sort of might operate differently to the sort of traditional rugby league culture that is predominant in the game because of Australian and English culture.
Yeah, I think probably because of that very difference that you mentioned there, and what we found particularly in PNG, we did, as you said, we had some players who were from PNG origins that were based in Australia, the majority who were PNG based that were based in PNG, but then even within PNG and the multifaceted complexities that is PNG, depending on which region and area in PNG you're from, your life is very different. So we were fortunate for the Pacific Championships at the end of last year that was held in Port Moresby. So we actually got to spend a whole cultural day finding out about the backgrounds of our players and our coaching staff and so forth. So we went to a region and we did it was a women's day. So the male staff weren't able to come to it. And we learned about cooking from the different regions, and we cooked meals together, and all of those sorts of things become incredibly important, because you're right, within some cultural aspects, to know who I am means that I can play alongside you, So, and I guess the other challenge that we had, and we particularly addressed it when we went to the World Cup, was we also had 2 different languages within the team. And even within Top Piston, there are, when I would be, say, doing when we were setting the team values, and we put all those values into Top Piston, because that was obviously far more culturally relevant and appropriate to do that than to have them in English. Even then, the discussion that came about when we'd come up with a particular value and how do we actually phrase that, and to make sure that we were respectful and to get that right, and that we'd get the buy-in from the players. So particularly, I guess, drawing on your point around family, incredibly important. And when you get that right and you address that within a team, I think part of the success that we've had within the Orchids is because of the respect for those cultural values and our way to integrate those as best we can. And it's a constantly emerging thing that we keep paying attention to. It translates onto the field.
Yeah, I know the phrase that Joe used last week was discretionary effort, which is that everybody tries to a minimum, but if you need people to try that extra bit, you got to give them a reason if they love each other or they, believe in the cause or something like that. And I think the Orchids are a great example of that, where they all have continually overperformed what you think they would be able to do. Just on the sort of, there's another aspect of it that I thought was very interesting when we met in camp back in Leeds, was that having the people who've come from Papua New Guinea and the people who grew up in Australia, and then putting them on tour together in a third place. I remember when we first met, everybody was sick because they'd just arrived and nobody could deal with the weather. Whether you'd come from Cairns or Port Moresby, it didn't make any difference because it was freezing and wet. And everybody who'd just arrived, including a lot of the white people journalists, also got sick. But that's stuff like that you're just having to deal with constantly when you're on tour and in this confined space where there's a limit. people who might not get on at the Cowboys, for example, go home to their families and don't have to deal with each other, but suddenly you're living on top of each other for 6 weeks. That's a whole different challenge for yourself.
Yeah, and that was certainly something that we dealt with before we even left Australia and PNG. So we knew that there were going to be challenges in addition to the challenges of playing in a World Cup. Let's not forget all those challenges that come along with it. But then it was all of those.
Boring rugby league.
Yeah, but when if you think about where some of our female players live on a day-to-day basis, and we knew about it, they'd walk past their neighbour's place and pick some sweet potato for dinner, and then they'd plant another thing and all the rest of it. And then, life was not terrible for us in Leeds at all, because we were staying at the Hilton Doubletree, so it was a very nice place to be. But that being said, very unfamiliar. And I think probably for me personally, if I can share a personal reflection, what that tour taught me as much as anything is how many assumptions I make in the world. So we had, as you mentioned, and as you know, a lot of our players weren't well in that first week. We worked out it wasn't actually the weather, it was the food. And even though so much effort had gone into, and the kitchen staff there were amazing, and the chefs were amazing at the Hilton, of making sure that we had familiar foods at every meal, so sweet potato and chicken and rice and all those sorts of things. What we didn't realize is when you have something like a coffee machine that sits outside the team room, and all you have to do is press a button and magic happens and you get this cappuccino in front of you. It took us a couple of days to work out that we needed to tell players that 12 cups of coffee is probably not conducive to, because it's in front of you, it's free, you walk through the door, and every time you walk through, you grab a coffee. So there was an education piece about being on tour that, of course, most of these players had never experienced before. So they were fabulous. They were so open to learning, but it was everything from how to navigate a buffet well, which I know is something that they teach young athletes at the Institute of Sport, because the same thing happens. You turn up at this incredible buffet with 5 different dinners there. Why wouldn't you load your plate up with everything? And then, then after 4 days, you're saying how boring the food is. So there's a lot of that, how to travel, how to be a professional athlete, which is a big part for all athletes to learn. And some, I guess every athlete comes from a different base in which they learn that. And so that's where some of those pathway programs are useful, say here in the NRL and NRLW, because it gives opportunity for players to see it and to live it and to pick up on a lot of those assumptions that, not everyone is necessarily learning when they're on their first World Cup.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's why I got sick as well, because I was eating nothing but fish and chips and curries. Now it all makes sense.
Yeah. We had a convenience store across the road, just, like a 7-Eleven kind of thing. And it was only then that we realised the difference in comparative difference in price of chocolate in the UK versus in PNG. Apparently, and it is, chocolate is quite expensive in PNG, obviously, because it's got to be imported and all the rest of it. So when you've got a cheap supply of chocolate and you don't normally have that, why wouldn't you eat it? And we're not talking like a little Freddo frog. We're talking about a big block of chocolate. So the education piece. Now we've got a group of athletes who, picked up so much wisdom on that trip, and now the legacy piece is, as they continue to play in the team and new players come in, is making sure we share that education component around it, so that at the next World Cup the team is equipped to be even more successful. And like you said, they were a team that far exceeded probably what people thought, but they were, the potential for where this team could go, I think, in the years to come is really, really exciting.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the legacy piece as well, because I feel obviously working with the Cowboys from scratch, that's another thing there's a wider point I guess we'll get to about dealing with male versus female athletes, which I'm fascinated to hear. But just while we're on sort of that legacy, like having to build a group dynamic out of 30 individuals who, some of the Cowboys players had played in, had played for Townsville Blackhawks, for example, but other ones, Fran Goldthorpe, who was playing in the Women's Super League in England, is a totally different. She doesn't know any of the girls, or there's other, players who've moved up specifically to play for that team. So how do you build that from nothing? Because going into any Cowboys team you go into in the men's game exists on the back of all the other Cowboys teams that existed before, whereas the NRLW, it is you're going from zero with. I know you had Ben Jeffries, who was the coach with the Orchids as well, so you would have that sort of knowledge with him as the kind of head honcho of it all. But how do you deal with completely different, building a group dynamic from scratch and making sure that everybody kind of fits where they need to go?
Yeah, there was certainly lots of preparation to address that very point in the lead in to the team coming together. So there was a very large staffing group. And wellbeing managers, and so we had lots of discussions around players who are transitioning in terms of their living arrangements to Townsville, and all of those sorts of dynamics, and was led by, as you said, by BJ and by Anita, the head of football there. And so we explored a whole range of different ways, and so shared experiences became very important, because the other thing a lot of these athletes were doing is a lot of them were leaving home for the first time as well. So all of the, how do you get groceries in your fridge? All those sorts of things that we learn along the way become very important. So, activities for the team became important. And most people in the North know what happened here, but on the very first day that the team came together, the team were told to congregate on at the high performance centre there out on the field, and so they came in their civilian clothes because they were coming to get their kit and our first day together as a team. And so the staff all came down from downstairs, and we were all in Cowboys uniform. And BJ said, and Anita said, I think, come on, we're going to go over to the stadium, show you your stadium, give you your kit. So, went into the change rooms, and the media team were there filming it, getting little grabs for the social media, and it was very exciting. And then the coaches made it look like an afterthought. And I think it might have been Alicia said, well, why don't we go out and have a look through the tunnel and you can see your stadium? And they walked through the tunnel, and we walked into the stadium. And they were all excited until they all looked up and they saw the abseiling ropes off the top of the stadium. And we had the team abseil off the roof of the stadium, which for our 2 Fijian players who had certainly never abseiled before, it was a welcome to Townsville. So, and we all did it. Everyone did it.
I think I had to quit the team there and then. No, thank you.
Yeah. So apparently you can't force people to abseil off a stadium, but what you can do is offer them. It was a challenge by choice. So the players were told that they had the choice as to whether or not they wanted to abseil, but they needed to make that choice on the roof of the stadium. So everyone got harnessed up, and I must say I was the last one to come off the stadium because there was a couple, but full credit to them. There was, and it's from those beginning moments where, as I'm looking at the group as they find out what's about to happen, and you can see the whites of some eyes that are truly terrified, that's where you start to form your team. That's where one of our senior players looked across, and she said to me, she said, Doc, which one do you think is most nervous? And she had picked someone out, and I said, yeah, I think she is looking a little concerned over there. So that player went straight over to her, put her arm around her and said, come on, sis, we're doing this together. So that's where you form those moments, and you form that sense of football family that then becomes important, because if the person who will, help you walk across the top of the stadium is the person that you'll do anything for when you're on the field. So you find those opportunities to build that team camaraderie. And that's what all clubs I would imagine are doing, particularly in that pre-season time of bringing together the dynamics of this particular group. Because even though you've got legacies across clubs, this is the only time you'll probably ever have this exact team, because I don't think there's probably too many teams that don't change even a couple of personnel each year. So every year for every club, it's a unique team, and clubs work very hard to bring that dynamic together.
Yeah, and it's almost that time of the year, and I'm conscious that I've literally about 50 more questions I could ask, and I'm sure you've got a busy day. But that time of year, like that way of building values in the preseason, because I always think from a tactical perspective, like we talk about this all the time on the field, is that you practice things in November because you'll need them the next October. Yeah, and that works just as much in the mental space as well, right?
Absolutely. And the thing is that when you've got a bit of a curriculum or a structure or a plan around building the mental capacity of players through a squad, you can build on it. So for us with World Cup with the Orchids, if I come back to that, a big ticket item for me was to help lead and work around the values piece for the team, and then to work with the staff to make sure that we were talking about values all of the time. Because there's no, I guess the indicator is if you go into an organisation, any organisation, and you say, what are your values? And the staff member has to momentarily turn and look up at the wall to read the values and to tell you what they are, then your values aren't working. So for values to truly resonate with a team, they have to be actionable behaviours. You need to know, if it's so one of our PNG values is talk true. So to talk true. So that means that if the coach gives an instruction to the players in a meeting and says, so we're going to do this play, and describes what the play is, is everyone clear on that? Now, typically what happens with a group of players is they'll all nod and say yes. Now, what we were able to do then is the coach would actually lean in and go, talk true. And for those players particularly those who wanted to please the coach, that was their moment where they knew they had permission to say, actually, no, I don't understand that. Or hang on a sec, so do you mean if we run here, then we do this? Or do we cut inside? Or, so you use teams and organisations that work well use their values to reinforce their behaviours, and that's what we then did in Pacific Champs. Is we built on the values again because we knew there was an adversity coming at the end of the week. So we spent our time discussing how will we use our values to navigate the adversity, and it worked beautifully. So yeah, having those things in place becomes really important.
And I guess a part of that, especially with the Orchids, but okay, I mean, maybe even with the Cowboys as well, is that you know that only one team can win, right? And you're going into a competition with the Jillaroos, Kiwi Ferns, like the England girls, like
England.
PNG are not, and you're in a group with England as well, right? So you know that the differing standards are such that you probably won't win those games. And going into the Cowboys year one in the NRLW, when you've got the Broncos with Ali Brigginshaw and the Knights and blah, 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 like, you know that at some point not failure, but you know what I mean, you're probably not going to win the comp. And so expectation management and like goal setting is such a big part of it. And at every level, only one team can win in rugby league. We don't really have, it's not like if you're in the Premier League, you can finish first, but you could also finish fourth and qualify for the Champions League, or you could win the Cup or whatever. In rugby league, especially in Australia and in the World Cup, obviously it doesn't really work like that. So how do you deal with that going, well, actually, when we want to win this, but it's probably not likely. So what is the secondary, tertiary goal after that?
Yeah. Every team I've ever been in, even if that is kind of an implicit understanding, it's typically not spoken out loud. So we didn't walk into any of those games saying we were going to lose them, even though, the weight of expectation was probably leaning that way. And I know that you can discuss the fact that, I don't know, Australia trot out their second side to play you, and then they still wallop you by 80 points, so those sorts of things can happen. But I mean, I guess that comes back to a fundamental psychology principle of, sure, absolutely every team wants to win. Absolutely, that is what we want to do. But wanting to win is not going to get us to winning. What will make us win? And then that's where the coaches with their expertise will say, well, this is the game plan that I think will win us the game, or that I know will win us the game. And then how do we implement it? So you try and bring it back to play by play, moment by moment. Players want to win. And I don't think we should shirk away from having those conversations. But what we need to build around it is all the process that gets you closer to winning. And, I guess in another sport I work in basketball, it's even a bit easier than that because it's 4 quarters, so you can build it down and play quarter by quarter. And you can do your halves in footy as well. And you can do it by passages of, plays and all those sorts of things. But breaking it down, what's my job right now? So again, it comes back to what we were talking about before, past, present, future. I know that, at the 80-minute mark, I want to be standing with a trophy over my head and confetti coming down. Like, that's a given. But right now, thinking about that when there's 100 kilos running towards me is probably not the best use of my mental space. So I guess that comes back down to one of those fundamentals again of past, present, future. And where's my head right now? Is it in the right place at the right time?
Yeah, and you've brought me on there to the basketball stuff, because I know I want to touch on that, given basketball and rugby league are complete other ends of a spectrum in terms of weak link versus strong link, where for people who don't understand what that is, it's basically in rugby league, you're only as good as your worst player, because that's what the team with the ball are going to run. Whereas in basketball, you can often have you're kind of as good as your best player, because you can throw the ball to LeBron James and he can do stuff that nobody else in the world can do. And there's only 5 people on a court. And if you've got one of them, then, you'll go pretty well a lot of the time. Like, for example, in the PNG context, if you've got LT Albert, who's one of the best front rows in the world, that's all well and good, but there's only 1 of 13 and the other 12 have got to tackle. Whereas, if this was basketball, having one of the best front rows in the world would help. Or the best center, yes. I don't know enough about basketball.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I know it's been topical at the moment has been the sort of perceived treatment of players relative to how good they are. So, there's a lot of talk the end of last season, start of this season, about Latrell Mitchell, Cody Walker get treated differently. And I thought this was interesting because in the off season, I read the biography of Wayne Bennett, in which he basically said Alan Langer had a free rein to do whatever he wanted because he was Alfie Langer. And I wonder, within a team dynamics setup, I'll use Elsie as an example because people know who she is, but like, if she's your best player for the Orchids, and I'm not saying she does this because I know she's lovely, but imagine that she knew that she was the best player and acted like it all the time, and all the other girls were like, this is she's a real difficult person to deal with, but however, she is also our best player and the best chance we have of winning. How do you deal with those dynamics? Because ultimately you want to win, and to win you have to have your best players, but it might be that best player is unpopular or fell or indulged by the coach or all this other stuff that just happens in any group dynamic.
Yeah, so certainly the personalities and also the status of the player, I guess, are those two elements that we're really talking about there, do come into play in how you manage it. And I've seen some coaches say, a bit like the example that you gave, and I'm just trying to think if I'm wording this correctly, is that not all players are necessarily treated equally, but all players will be treated fairly, is usually the approach a coach might take. And I guess it depends on those dynamics. So I've certainly worked with players, and we were talking about basketball, and basketball is different for a range of reasons. I can remember years ago, we used to have the Townsville Crocodiles here in Townsville, which was a men's NBL team. Sadly, they're not playing in the league anymore. And it was just on a day when I'd had a rugby league player come in, and then the next appointment was a basketball player. And I was having a little chuckle to myself, like even the dynamics of how they sat in my room was different. The culture, never mind the culture of the individual sitting in front of you, but the culture of the sport can be quite different as well at times. And the other thing that basketball have, like you say, is if you've got a gun on your team, well, there's only 4 other players on the court. So whereas like an Elsie can be diluted depending on who else is on the field with her. So you've got a range of differences there. And I think what it means is, when I've seen it work well, like I think I've said this to you before, the most competitive athlete that I have ever worked with, and she knows I say this about her, and she agrees with me probably, is Susie Bakovic. So Susie
she wouldn't agree if she wasn't so competitive. So
no, that's right. Susie's hilarious. So Susie has retired from basketball. For those who don't know her, I don't even know how many championships and how many MVPs she's won. She's been to 3 Olympics. She's played in every major competition in Europe and in the US as well. She's an outstanding athlete. She is a great human, and she is fiercely competitive. So if I can give a non-sporting example to typify it, she's now a mum of twins. She's a city councillor here in Townsville. Her twins are about 4 or 5. And in the mornings, most parents will say to their kids, come on, let's get ready. I'll race you. Who can get dressed first to get to the front door? Now, parents often use that as a strategy just to get the kids to hurry up. Susie uses that as a strategy just because she wants to start her day with a win and beating her kids. So she is ferocious. I was very fortunate. I spent a lot of time with Susie. Susie is actually one you were talking before about how do people recover from mistakes. Susie wrote a foreword for my second book, which is called In the Grandstands. It's a parenting guide for surviving teenage sport. And when Susie and I were talking about that, she said, as a young athlete, her mum was in the crowd cheering her on. Every single game, was just one of those really vocal parents. But she said you would sit at the court and you would not know whose child was hers, because she would equally cheer the opposition as she would cheer her. But Susie said that through her entire childhood basketball, she would, every time she missed a shot, she would hear her mum from the crowd go, that's okay, you're one step closer to getting it in. That's all right, doesn't matter, keep going. So Susie actually said in the book, she said, I think one of the reasons I've took so many shots in my career is because I knew I was just getting closer to converting the next basket. So she didn't interpret it as failure. It was just an opportunity to get closer to success. So Susie is a good example of, she was a very competitive athlete against the opposition and within her own team. And there would be times when, younger players, the rookie would come in, and Susie, she wanted to win more than anyone, and she wanted you to do your best to get to the win. So she could look at you sideways. If you weren't pulling your weight, she could look at you sideways, and we'd have a rookie in tears. And they just had to. Sometimes a coach might take a player aside and go, look, you've got to be mindful how you speak to the team and so forth, and try and change that player. And certainly Susie was very mindful of, and always very respectful. But if you aren't giving your all, she's going to tell you, and she'll blast you. But then a minute later, she'll carry you on her back and get you there. So she's a great example of an athlete who is very competitive in that space and probably did get treated differently to other players. But, we won championships off the back of it. And players, I guess what conversation I would have with other players is, but what's her intent? She's not being tough on you because she's mean. She's being tough on you because she thinks you can be better and she wants to win a championship. So as a small aside, she wrote the foreword to my second book, and it was coming back from the editor, and I said to her, Suze, do you want to have a look at any changes that the editor made? And as you mentioned before, Jonathan wrote the foreword for my first book, and she said to me, no, Jo, I don't need to read it. Just make sure it's better than Jono's. So she competes in everything. Yeah, she's fabulous.
That's it's almost good story to end on, but I do want to ask you this because I know I brought it up before, and it's something that I'm fascinated in. I think it would be a good sort of place to end on, is that you've obviously worked for years across men's sport and women's sport, and I'm interested to know in the differences between the two in terms of how you deal with the athletes, because I don't know, I feel like the public perception would be that women aren't as competitive, which I think is anyone watching the NRLW would see is complete nonsense. But from your professional perspective, are there aspects that you have to, differences between male and female athletes in the way that you talk to them?
Not in the way that I talk to them. I don't think I'm particularly different with any of the athletes that I work with, because I certainly see lots of differences in the athletes that I work with, but I wouldn't hang it on it's because of their gender, I don't think. The first thing that came to mind as you asked that question is there are some things within women's sport that we address that we don't in men's, and a lot of that has to do with women's health as well. So, there might be particular issues that we talk to them about in terms of their cycles or their physiology or so forth. So there's some very clear differences there. But no, I would probably say, dynamics are different, but they're different across teams, So I think it's probably, for me, I tend to sit with, I think gender is too broad a category to go, well, they're this or they're this. So I think when people make those generalizations, I think it's usually pretty much off the mark. And you mentioned Fran Goldthorpe before. There's a character,
player, but I am very biased in favour of.
And you said, I think what caught my ear was you said Fran arrived and she didn't know anyone. Well, everyone knew Fran within 45 seconds of her getting there, because she's such a great personality and such a great person, so committed to the team and so forth. So you get those personalities, and I've met equivalent personalities in basketball and rugby league, in men's and women's games as well. So I think I tend to steer away from the differences being gender based, and I think it's more individually based, and then you see some of those themes. So it really depends on the culture and the personalities that come within a team, and I've seen those be very different across different teams that I've worked with over the years.
Well, it's been so enlightening. I think this is the longest podcast we've actually done so far, and I've more questions.
Sorry, I can talk.
No, that's exactly why we got you on. So thanks so much for your time. I'm gonna save these questions, and when we do a piece later in the year, I've got loads about injury and how people deal with setbacks. So I might try and get you back on and talk.
Yeah, would love to.
A wider point on that, because I feel like we're only really scratching the surface of it. So thanks.
Yeah.
Did I tell you
about my PhD? Have I told you about
that's why I wrote the questions. I do my research. I'm a pro.
Yeah, but even I thought that I had told you. I did a podcast with someone else yesterday. I didn't know about it. But the other thing would be is, and look, Mike, I'm sure if ever you were doing a podcast on injury and you wanted to get, say, 3 different viewpoints on it, like an exercise phys and a doctor and if you want to pull me in just for a little piece too, I'm always happy to do that.
That is exactly what I was already thinking of, and it's going on my big list of old podcast ideas as we speak.
Nice.
That's the point of this podcast, is that we get to deep dive, and I call it slow takes. We try and, there's no hot takes here. We just try and talk these things through. It's not really, I don't know if we have cold take. Cold take sounds bad. Slow takes is what I like, because
slow take.
I feel like nobody, a rugby league is very always on to the next thing, and there's so much depth to the sport that we can go into. So I will hold that thought for another day, because I know that is your, what you initially started on was the injury recovery stuff, and I know there's a whole other piece in that down the line. So for now at least, please plug your new book, which is coming out, because I forgot to.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Yes.
Believe.
So, yes. Do you want me just to talk about it?
Talk about it, please do.
Just talk about it. So, thank you for the opportunity to talk about the books. So, this is my fourth book that's coming out. I'm very excited. It's coming out in April 2024. So, it's called Belief, Building Unshakable Confidence. So, this is probably the book that I wanted to write first of all. So, The Elite was really about translating lessons of elite performance into everyday life. But then a whole heap of athletes picked it up and read it and applied it for themselves. So that wasn't quite my intended purpose, but I'm glad that they found that helpful. So Belief is actually a sports psychology book. So it covers some of those key concepts that I think athletes can work on to help them to build their belief, deal with their inner coach, how they can sort of sort through their ideas. And then later in the year, the second part of that book a second book is coming out, which is called Compete. And if I can just quickly tell you, Mike, a story behind why I wrote that book first is when I looked at all the content I wanted to include, there was too much content. Like no one wants to read a 500-page book on sports psychology, or maybe some people do. But so I knew I wanted to split them, and I knew I wanted to write one book called Belief and one book called Compete. And I didn't know which one to write first. And so what I did for a month is every elite athlete and coach I crossed paths with, I said to them, you've got two books in front of you. One's called Belief, one's called Compete. Which one are you going to pick up? And I did this little straw poll in the back of my notebook that I carry with me everywhere just to see which was going to be the most popular. And by the end of the month, it was 50-50. So that was a totally futile.
But
then one of the emerging, like a player at the level that you were talking about, a player who's emerging through, I said to him, which book would you pick up? And he just goes, Belief. And I said, okay, you said that pretty quickly. And I said, you seem pretty sure on that. And he goes, yeah, Joe. He said, because if you don't have belief, you can't compete. And I went, aha, good point. So Belief is the first book that's been written, and then Compete will be the next one. So people can pick them up from their local indie bookstores. Just go in and ask about it. You can find it on my website or all the big conglomerate online, wherever you get your books, you'll be able to find Belief, Building Unshakable Confidence. So thank you for allowing me to share that with the audience.
No, you sent me Elite after we first met, and I read it, and I read it again before speaking to you. It's not enormously long. You can read it in a couple of days, as I did. I'm a fast reader, but other readers will probably be fine. It's very interesting, rattles along. And one of the things I actually enjoyed most about the Elite is that there's a whole section which you can go, well, this is the bit that applies most to me, and click through. So I didn't read it in order. I read it in order.
No, that's how I designed it. Bit more like a smorgasbord than a main meal.
Yeah. I like a tapas of a.
Yes, the tapas of sports psychology. You might put you on the marketing team.
Well, I used to be a copywriter. These things come naturally. What I've done now, I've traded the life of writing 3-word headlines to writing interminably long articles.
Very good.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for your time, Jo.